Hello, story seekers. I'm Nico.
I'm Ben, and welcome to the Tiny Bookcase. Right now, you're listening to our favourite part of the week.
Stories, discussion, and a high likelihood of gratuitous obscenities, all to sate the hunger of the bibliomancer Eusteris.
Regular listeners will know how it works, but for newcomers, Nico and I have both written a story to the same shared prompt.
We're about to share those stories with each other and you for the first time, and then we'll workshop them on mic. The prompt for this episode is Haunt, and Ben, seeing as you so rudely left me hanging, you're going first with part two of your story from last week.
Haunt. Masaryk sat cross-legged in their shelter, slurped the stew down as though he had not already feasted. This was much to the delight of their boys, who all copied his slurping and then grinned up at him with messy faces. Lorna saw that his fatherly smile looked brittle, and knew she would have to approach her task carefully. In her years with the Legion, she had often made pretend that the groans of pain and moans of grief in the camp after a battle were tricks of the wind. Whilst the air that night was thick with gusts of rain, she could no longer shelter in that fantasy, as snatches of anguish found gaps in the canvas walls. She now knew that sound better than the tattoo the orcs beat on their war drums to call for the bar rag. "You used the last of the sod?" he asked, as the boys stuffed themselves into bedrolls they were fast outgrowing. "I did." Lorna left out what else she'd put in it. "It was nice." Masaryk yawned, looking at peace to be amongst his family. She took off her outer dress, snuffed their candles, and lay next to him. His skin was still damp with the sweaty water he had used to scrub off the filth of battle, and the moisture clung the fabric of her underdress to him. She saw that his body, whilst rippling with the swell of muscles, was in poor condition. Lumps, bruises, cuts, splits lay on his flesh like a tapestry of violent reminders. She waited until his breathing deepened to a snore, then rolled away to stand in the dark of their shelter. The gurdy root he and the boys had eaten would give them deep and restful slumber, or so she hoped. Lorna relit the candle from the embers of their cooking fire and saw Masaryk's hammer was where he always left it, leant just inside the shelter by his armour. She dragged it across the ground towards where he lay, half covered by the blankets they shared. By the light of the candle, she fixed her gaze on his exposed right knee, willing herself to strike. With a stifled grunt, she raised the heavy weapon high, tensed, and brought it down. The gore-spattered head of the hammer failed to connect with Masaryk's knee, landing instead on his thigh. The meat smack of it shuddered up the haft and went through Lorna's forearms, breaking her grip. She felt as though her heart were temporarily stopped and scrabbled to pick the hammer back up for another swing. Masaryk leapt from their blankets, a roar of confused pain hissing past his fangs. She saw a huge bruise blossoming where she had struck, as he kicked heavily at the haft of his hammer, jerking it from her hands again. One of his mighty fists was clenched and ready to strike, but it did not fall on her. She watched his confusion crystallize into calculating anger. The boys, awoken by their father's roar, blinked at the tableau, trying to understand what had happened. She stared at them wordlessly as he gathered the four of them up, telling them to wait outside. When they had done as they were told, Masaryk scooped up his hammer, touching his belly with his other hand. "You will know if they need you again. Until then, they are mine." Lorna felt as though his words had plunged her into a deep well of icy water. No sounds came out of her mouth as he brushed past her. She sat down heavily in the empty shelter and did not break from the shock of it until the cawing of carrion birds heralded the morning. Harold came to her then, just as the smells of cooking breakfast permeated her shelter. The older man was ashen-faced as he spoke. "I have an understanding of what happened last night. Do you deny what you did?" Lorna blinked her reddened eyes and shook her head. "Then I have to tell you that you won't hang. Masaryk insisted that you should be spared. Instead, I have brought your widow's coin with me, and I hope that you will take it and depart with Shiara and the others today for friendly territory. Rest assured that the boys will always have a place in my tent." Lorna said nothing to him, and after a time he left, only to be replaced by Shiara, who sat with her in silence, nursing her baby. Eventually, she left too. The order to break camp was issued that afternoon, and, her body merely going through the motions, Lorna packed up their shelter. She committed their belongings back to the wagon and rejoined the trudge of families following the marching soldiers. No one spoke to her all that day, and Lorna felt the person she had been draining out of her like water from a punctured pail. What it left behind could walk, it could breathe, it could eat, but it was not a full person. Somewhere ahead of her, she knew that her boys would be walking with their father. The thought felt like a wound that had been numbed. Day by day, Lorna faded as she failed to reconnect with her boys, until the passing of time became a constant ache in her empty existence. She was allowed near no food as it was being prepared, and found herself under constant supervision of one woman or another. She was, however, permitted to help with the tasks of laundry and fire-making. Those simple jobs proved to be something she could focus on, imagining that what she washed was for her own family. The only kind words she received were the other women saying to each other that they would miss her hands when she was dropped off. Masaryk's companions were sure to warn him of her whenever she dared draw too close to them, either during their march or at camp. She often found herself physically dragged from them, and on some days she would shout the names of her boys from afar, hoping to remind them of her. The next battle came too soon for the other families, and not soon enough for Lorna. News of it thrummed through the wagon convoy. The Orcs had amassed in a valley to the north of Fool's Bluff, a mighty border stronghold which guarded the river route into the heart of the kingdom. The Legion would attack the Orcs from within their own lands, just as the force within the keep sallied out at dawn the next day. Hammer and anvil, that's what everyone kept saying. Hammer and anvil. Orcs, she knew, could withstand a great deal of hammering. When the morning came, Lorna waited until the army had slipped away to surprise the enemy before leaving camp herself. Despite yearning for it, she did not chance a visit to her sons. Instead, she took her pack and followed after the army as they slunk through the morning mist. The dirt track, made a wide swathe by the boots of the Legion, wound up to the lip of the valley. By the time she reached the lip, she could make out the dark mass of soldiers already halfway down to meet the enemy. No sounds of alarm came from the Orcs, and the embers of their fires showed as dull points of light in the mist. Lorna slipped her pack from her shoulders and drew out the object within. The wood of the crude drum was stained with ichor and blood, whilst the skin of it, taken from a human's back, was stretched taut over one end. Without a thought beyond her plan, Lorna banged at it as she had heard her enemies do all those years. Gung 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 gung. The sound of it was so loud in the silence of the morning that she felt near deafened by it, and strained to hear noises from the valley below. Nothing happened for a long moment. She imagined the confusion of Masaryk and his companions, and began to fear they would come back up and stop her before she was heard. Then the shriek began. From where they dwelt in the valley, Lorna heard 100 Orc throats scream out with battle lust. The Bar Rag. Then 1,000 more joined them, and more, until the valley shook. The pain felled her not long after the first sounds of clashing weapons. Masaryk always led from the front. She felt as though she had been gouged through her lower back, and the pain had torn something loose from her. There was no one to give her comfort through it, as she had for Shiara. The knowledge that she had succeeded left her with just enough determination to force herself to stumble and crawl back down the path. She left behind the sounds of the slaughter that she had wrought, and made as quickly as she could to be reunited with her boys. Harold's wife was stood by their large tent at the heart of the Legion's camp. The woman held up her hands when she saw Lorna approach out of the mist. "They are not here, and you shouldn't be either. Where have you been?" "Where are they?" hissed Lorna through gritted teeth. "Their father deemed it right to blood them with today's victory." The emptiness inside Lorna became impossibly heavy with the woman's words. Her knees buckled, and the bond pain she had been striving to muffle made her retch. In the last moment, before her mind finally snapped, she wondered piteously if there would be anyone left to feast her bondmate and their boys.
Well, it was a nice, cheerful turn, I think, after the first part.
Hey man, you gave me the prompt haunt.
I did do that. Um, so there's some interesting stuff that I wanted to talk about in it. A couple of really nice character bits. Like there was a bit when she said orcs can take a lot of hammering. She knew that. That's a really nice line because she's referring to her husband just as an orc at that point,
Yes,
and it tells you that like he's the enemy now. That's just it's like a change of perspective that I really liked, and picking up on it, I was like, that's very clever. I like that a lot.
good.
Um, Harold absolutely fucked that guy, as with part one. Um, your boys will always have a place in my tent. I bet they will, you slave driving bastard. Um, the At the beginning, I thought that she was drugging the soup because she didn't tell him what else was in it. So
Yes,
I was,
she
was it
yeah,
just like
maybe
not
that hasn't
not enough
landed.
of a dose?
No, I think it's just the fact that she knew she was only going to get one hit on him.
Ah, okay.
Um,
I thought she'd fucked it up. I mean,
no,
obviously you messed up the swing, but
I suspect it's. I mean, obviously, I didn't really have time to go into the there. Maybe I should have done. Maybe I should have made that a bigger deal if I was going to include it. Um, but I sort of got the impression that at least from the first part that he would be quite twitchy that night,
yeah,
but
yeah,
also at his weakest. Um, so the thought of like her feeding him like a sort of a nourishing, hearty stew that also happens to be laced with like a restorative sleeping agent. It just sort of came to me that that would be a good way to get her in a position where she can try and actually harm him.
friendship.
Yeah,
Yeah,
obviously her intention there is to hobble him so he can't fight, which means that they all have to go home,
yeah.
um, which is, is something I've had partners say to me before about like you know um, if you were going to go off to war, I think I'd just hurt you so you couldn't. This is
Normal, sensible human things to say to another human.
yeah, I know, right? Um, but yeah, I'm sort of building off uh, more extreme characteristics that I've observed in the women in my life in the past.
Yeah.
Um,
I
yeah,
I do have a writerly note for you. I'm learning from
let's do it.
the best being you, Ben. When you're talking about the his body having all the different injuries on it, I think you need to employ the rule of three because you mentioned four types of injury, and by the fourth, it felt very. I know you're saying like there's a lot on him, but it started to feel cumbersome
Mm,
and a bit too listy. And I think taking one of them that sounds sort of less injury-ish out, that's definitely not a real word. But like dropping one of them out, I think would it's just something about that trifecta thing, isn't it, that makes it land a bit harder. And it's rare that I have a note like that for you, so I thought I'll make a
mm.
note of it and actually say it. But yeah,
I think
that's
it's a
in
good
terms
note.
of the actual writing, that's the only one I've got.
Yeah, I mean, I'd be interested to know if you have anything to do with like structure as well on it, or whether you've got any thoughts when having heard both halves. Like,
Actually, I will say one thing about the structure, and I think it might just be because I got lost because you have a good habit with short stories of saying things, then my brain sort of wanders off. Like you were talking about take your widow's pay, and I thought, oh, I wonder what these women go off and do with that. Like, are there a bunch of half orc bakeries knocking around with like set up with widow's pay? Like, what's happening? But
yeah,
I thought they were being like sent like away, like you don't get to be on the front line anymore. But she was still there, and I think I got that's probably just on me.
no, that's what happened.
Yeah.
Like
Okay.
the other ones were sent away, and she just sort of
And
like
she just
followed them.
hung about. Yeah,
Yeah,
okay.
that was my interpretation of haunt was that she was just quite
She was
literally
just
like
she was haunting them. Yeah,
she was
okay.
haunting them. Yeah.
Yeah, then
Um,
that's just on me.
That's okay. That's okay. I think potentially there are areas where this isn't as clear as I'd like it to be.
Mm,
It it's a bit of a fucker actually because obviously this was a two-part story, and I knew
yeah,
like the bones of the kind of story that I wanted to tell. I wanted to focus on the emotional plight of the mother in this kind of family dynamic in both halves. Like the whole story wanted to be about that.
yes,
And a lot of the sort of like fantasy world building meant that that encroaches on word limit, doesn't it?
yeah.
But also you do, as I said last week, you do get a real taste for it and start to really enjoy like little bits of world building. So I put that widow's coin thing in there deliberately to get people to go, huh, that's a good idea, or like to imagine what they might think that means. But
It,
if
it,
I'm doing that to the point where people are being like, oh wait, hang on a sec, the story moved on. Where am I? Then that's not working as well as I'd intended.
oh no, I think it's. I just have an overactive imagination. But I think that did do a good thing of cementing, like in a big way, Harold, more of him, because he's a character I really uh, got attached to, was the wrong term, but really sort of found an interesting angle in from both this part and the previous part. And him like having the thought of, is this something he's set up because he wants these men to go in fighting? He's like, yeah, don't worry, I look after your widow. If anything were to happen, heavens forbid, I will look after your widows. Like,
Hmm.
or is this a thing that's socially acceptable that he is doing like begrudgingly? I guess what I'm saying is I want more Harold story and I want to see him get his comeuppance.
If this was like a long form TV show or a movie or something, I feel like Harold would be played by some sort of like older British actor with lots of gravitas.
Yes.
Like a small role but done well, if that makes sense. That would be. I think that's what that, because I think you are right. He is quite an interesting character, and I think normally that's the character that I might have written this from the perspective of, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Which
Yes,
might be
definitely.
which might be why he is like that. Um, but I've tried to show it from a perspective I don't normally use. Um, yeah, I think overall I'm quite happy with it. I think both halves need a bit of work, and potentially it needs even more words. Like this comes in at already well over 3,000 with the two parts now.
Yeah.
Um, so I
So
think it might
join us
fit.
for part three.
No, I'm definitely not doing a part three. But I feel like when I eventually edit this out and maybe try and submit it places, I think it could quite firmly fit in that 3 to 5,000 word bracket, sort of
Yeah,
more substantial short story length than the
I think
short ones.
I think you're right. There's definitely, I think, even given another 1,000 words to
Mm.
stretch its legs and flex those big orky muscles in some places, there's some very cool stuff in here that could, even in short story as opposed to the kind of microfiction we do form, give you a super cool world to play with.
Mm.
I think you've done a lot of good, if more than groundwork, really. You've written two good short stories, but especially together and with your considerable editing and adding that I know you do with stuff like this, I think it could be really, really good.
Oh, cool. Well, that's really nice. Thank you. I think for one reason and another, this week's been a bit sort of trying for both of us, hasn't it? I mean, you've
Yeah,
probably copped to the fact that this is going to be coming out a little later than we normally release our episodes, um, and that's primarily just because life got in the way to a certain degree. So I
yeah,
think it was quite difficult but very fulfilling to come back and write and perform the second half of the story before these various difficulties got in the way. So yeah, I'm feeling cleansed, but in a sort of like a
yeah.
detoxed way. This story was kind of like wound up inside me, and I sort of had to get it out. I think.
Do you think you'll be in a rush to do a two-parter again?
But potentially not. I think there's something off about getting halfway through a story and then pausing and then doing the other half. I think that doesn't quite work like with the way that the editing process works after you've written a first draft. Yeah, I'm not sure I'd do it this way around again. I think as I've sort of said and we sort of joked about before, it might be easier to just write 3,000 words and snap it in half if you were to do that. So we've had the conclusion to my two-parter story about orcs and half orcs and the disaster lives they leave behind them. And it's time for your story, a fresh tale, no doubt.
Well, let's hope so. Haunt. Proxima V fiddled incessantly with the cabling that connected her networking jack to the small fission reactor built into the flight suit. It was a habit that she'd picked up in training jumps all those years ago, checking every connection, thumbing every rivet, just so that she could be certain there would be no explosive decompression, no sudden downspike in neural activity, no ever sundering of psyche from physique. She wasn't qualified to check any of the equipment, but she had to do it. It was a charm now, much like the stickers that coated every millimetre of bare sin steel on G's flight suit. Everyone had their thing, the thing that had worked for them on every jump and would continue to do so near religiously right up until it didn't. This had always been the way with soldiers, far back as the first battle lines. Some kept their dents for luck and others hammered them out, but all believed their solution was the correct one. V tugged once again at the cables, willing them in some way to dare to be loose. They weren't. The engineering squad assigned to Proxima Unit would be one of the finest available to whichever corporation was paying them for this jump. It was V, G, and somewhere R was getting a debrief. Not a huge corpo, if it was only 3 members falling, but enough firepower they must be going after something big. Proxima Squad was, in many ways, a pretty standard cybersecurity unit. When digital real estate had started holding more value than actual land, the big companies had suddenly stopped needing skyscrapers, and little bulbs in space had become the hearts of quadrillion-dollar empires. The grubby back rooms of a million tiny companies had been scoured until fine minds in tech security had been found, and the long, slow data war had begun. Some corpos tried to build firewalls so thick you could never hope to breach them. They built digital forces to rival Alexander the Great. Others built countermeasures, tunneling software, turbulent worm code so aggressive that had one managed to eat its way into your system, you might lose a century's value in seconds. And then the war had begun to revert, and the data war had become physical. And that was where the Haunt came in. Hyper-altitude upload neuron troopers. It had never rolled off the tongue, but an anagram which may have spawned the name, or been a piece of fortune, had sat in its stead in all conversations revolving around cybersecurity's suicidal defenders. The concept was somewhere between genius and pure madness, exactly where success of this kind comes from. A trooper like Proxima V was cased in their suit, not unlike one of the satellites they'd be assaulting. Then they were launched from terra firma at a little over twice the speed of sound. Their minds temporarily uploaded from their physical bodies into a small nuclear-powered transmission device. Then the idea is simple. Break atmosphere, allow your brain to be broadcast into the target device of whichever corpo you're assaulting, and begin freefall. Out of atmosphere, there was little to no protection for close-range comms. After all, why would anyone be out there? At least that's what they thought when the satellites had launched. Then, while your expertise translated seamlessly into binary code attacked the device, the squad would freeform. You had roughly 2 minutes and 23 seconds before you were a crater wherever the axis movement of the planet had put you, which meant you had roughly 2 minutes to do your job, fire your consciousness back at your body, and hopefully wake up fast enough to fire the suit's dampening thrusters. Then you might just take some broken bones and a few bruises. It was a technique that worked surprisingly well, considering the numbers on paper had left a 0% survival rate as the likely possibility. And some members of the Haunt had got really good at it, and a great many of them, Proxima V included, had become addicted to that strange sensation. The moment of true death of ego, as everything that made a person became digital. Proof of the lack of a soul. Intrinsic proof of the fallibility of gods all over that dust ball underneath them. Just true, anarchic freedom. A mind adrift in such a simple form that it could be written on a wall. Though that wall would have to circumnavigate the globe 1,000 times. But once you'd done it, it all became worth the risk of death. Because weren't you already dead anyway? Many thought perhaps those who came back were not truly alive anymore. Just machines, in some way programmed to remember the lives they had before the jump. Proxima V pulled gently at the cables on her helmet one last time, to be absolutely certain that the ritual testing had worked. She could hear R's voice, rich and bassy, bouncing around the hallway that led to the compact chamber she waited in. She banged on the glass between her launch tube and G's, and the sticker-laden suit turned and nodded in approval. The almond eyes and smooth, dark skin of G were entirely consumed by the flight suit. But it didn't matter, because they were not who G was. Only the code was G. And soon they would be reduced once again to their numbers. And V, G, and R would intertwine inexorably in a mathematical cacophony. And they'd do the job, and they'd break or fix or change or whatever those greedy money people wanted, just so they could be code for the briefest of moments. All before the misery of meat and survival came back, and they waited for the next job. As the sound of the door opening gave a muffled, grinding whir through the glass, V forced her helmet over her head, eagerly swallowing the tube that would breathe for her on their descent. Without even looking to R, she stepped into place in the dark recess of the launch tube, surrounded by the thermal scars of previous launches, and for a moment felt the closest thing her physical body could to bliss. The rumbling of the ground beneath her heralded the start of the greatest sensation possible, beyond the thrill of ecstasy, more potent than sniffing the light from a nation's eyes. Soon there would be nothing but cold and death and the haunt.
Well, I could have listened to that for a lot longer than I was. That does that idea feel larger than the story you wrote for it? Out of any
Absolutely.
interest?
Yeah, it was one of those ones that as I was writing it, I was like, oh, I think I'm going to have to write more of this. And we said that the last time I started writing a cyberpunky thing was quite a while ago. But I think I do need to actually take some time and and write some stuff in this sort of world because I did connect to it and realize that I really want to expand these ideas out, and I don't have the word count to do it here.
Oh, fascinating! Absolutely fascinating, because you speak it so fluently, and it feels like this would flow on a larger scale as well. I really enjoyed the introduction to this idea of the haunt. The was it hyper altitude ultra neuron troopers?
It's upload neuron troopers.
Upload neuron troopers. Yeah, sorry, I made it sort of like Shin Ultraman for some reason. Um,
It did get very American high schoolers out of the outfits, Japanese stunt performers in the outfits, didn't it, for a second?
no, I think it was just it was a good name. Um, I really enjoyed all of the like little tech niblets that you had in there. The sort of sticker strewn bear sin steel, I think you called the sin steel.
Yes.
Um, really enjoyed. I felt like you really nailed this idea of a war going digital, and then getting so strong digitally that they have to. That all of a sudden, physical weaknesses are actually the only option.
Yeah.
Um, really enjoyed that, and this idea of like railgunning your consciousness out and then back again, terrifying. Really enjoyed it.
I
Um,
think that was definitely when I was like, no, this is what I'm going to write. When I thought about these high altitude troopers, like, oh, what if you had to get so close to the satellites you could basically touch them,
yeah,
but to hack them you needed the full power of multiple human brains? Like, what would a body even do? Like, it's such a fun concept to play
yeah,
with.
yeah. I think so. I think so. Um, there was a line really near the start which I just thought was just absolutely solid writing, which was ever sundering psyche from physique.
Mm,
I don't know whether that's like a writer's line, but I really enjoyed it. So well done. Um, because it was this concept of ever sundering being like an actual threat, right?
yeah,
Yeah, no, I liked it a
like
lot.
it's the first clue about what they're going to do. There were multiple takes of that line, so I'm glad I landed on a good
Yeah,
one
you did. No, that
because
was it flowed really well as well. Yeah, very good.
there were a few versions of it where I thought no, because I don't want to give it away too much, but that doesn't sound sort of dangerous and scary enough. So I'm glad it's
The-
it's it's
Yeah,
nice when a line stumps you a bit and then you get something good at the end. So that's good.
the proof of a lack of a soul section was really interesting. I liked that a lot. It it felt like they were going through something that was like the opposite of ego death.
Yeah,
Like they weren't feeling small in this universe, were they? No, like typically when you isolate someone's consciousness through through like things like sensory deprivation or through chemicals or however you're going to do it, there is a kind of ego death that happens when they realize that there's things that are bigger than them.
yeah.
But in this instance, they are basically in space, and just their minds are being, as I said, railgunned about, and they're like, there is no God, there is no, you know what I mean? It was
There is
it
no
was
God in the machine. There is no
it was
Deus
like
Ex Machina. There's just Machina.
exact yeah, it's all machine. It was very much oh, I don't know. It just gave me interesting goosebumps. I had a
Yeah,
really good time with that story. I had a lot of fun with it. I think as soon as I heard that you were talking about fission reactors and this kind of thing, I was like, oh, thank fuck. I've been really looking at the moment in my own sort of life generally. I've been looking for like a bit of sci-fi to get my teeth into, and you gave it to
yeah.
me in like 10 minutes. So really enjoyed it. Really enjoyed it.
It's I do directly blame you for it, but I've started getting a real hard on for like super high risk sci-fi. So this movement away from space opera into yeah, but what if everything was one incorrect push of the enter button from people being ejected into space?
Yeah,
It's just it's
it's the
so
best, man.
big and it's fascinating to me that we're so into fantasy worlds. I mean, specifically you and I, so into fantasy worlds, but we have space all around us and even oceans on this planet that we know absolutely jack all about that are just as frightening
Yeah,
as dragons.
uh, absolutely. Explosive decompression. You just reminded me of it when you said dragons. Then, yeah. The bit about decompression. Were you thinking at all about that pipeline story that you told me the other day?
Oh no, I just stopped thinking about
You
that. So
just stopped.
thank
Oh,
you.
I've done that. I've done that. Would you like to pre-see it for our audience?
uh, the let's do the quick crib notes version. It was an oil rig, well, a pair of oil rigs joined by a large underwater superstructure pipe, and some chaps had been asked to open one end of it in order to allow it to be reconnected. And when it was seemingly impossible to open, instead of going and reporting that, what they did was put a load of force into opening it. The change in pressure sucked them and all of their equipment several hundred feet down a pitch black, partially submerged in water and oil pipe. And one of the men crawled back to where they'd come down in utter darkness, unsure if he was going in the right direction, and frequently having to swim through uh, pools of oil and water with no way of knowing how much longer he had to hold his breath for. So that's
It's
quite
not.
haunting.
It's nightmare fuel. And this actually happened as well. This happened. Um,
Yes, this did happen.
so I'm glad I could remind you of that with your own story.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, it's all right.
It may have been in there rattling around because I mean
Maybe.
they were in big pipes ready to be
Yeah.
launched.
Yeah. 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 The other thing that it sparked for me of what's going on at the moment. Were you aware the other day of that? The British general talking about potentially needing like a citizen army for like to apparently, and I don't know how much bullshit is going on here, but apparently there's been a huge drop off in the British Armed Forces in terms of the amount of personnel, and this general was sort of saying that we need to do a push because it there is a likelihood that there might be some kind of ground fighting on like European soil relatively soon,
Well,
and it just got me thinking because your story is all about how tech precludes the need for war, and
yeah,
then, or at least the war changes, the theatre of war changes to like a technologically sort of digital realm. Then that stops and it
yes,
goes back to being the physical. And
it's
one thing that did happen this week was that an American airbase in the Middle East got drone struck, and
yes,
you don't often hear about Americans getting drone struck, do you? Like it's
I
normally
do not.
they're normally the ones doing the striking with the drones. You know what I mean? And that's the loss of life is ridiculous on both sides of any conflict. It's all fucking ridiculous. Um, but it was when one of their own recon drones was coming back into base, so they shut down all the defenses that would stop a drone, and at that exact moment they got hit by a drone.
Oh wow.
So they like fully got tech fucked. Um, in a way that they had been doing, and it filled me with this cold horror that we have reached a point where we are just like both sides of any conflict are going to be able to just snipe each other with drones. Um,
That's really frightening.
yeah, no, it's absolutely terrifying. So this idea of like potentially like conscription coming back in the UK and um, both sort of Western and other forces all drone striking each other. That was all going on inside my head. I took that into your story, and it had a home.
I think actually I've just remembered that I saw a news story the other day where Elon Musk is claiming to have put a chip in someone's brain as well, isn't he?
Yes,
That can
the first
cure
human trial apparently.
psychological disorders. So, maybe it is all coming. Maybe all I've done is written some news stories from next week.
I mean, people have made careers off doing that kind of thing, so
Yeah, true, true, true.
I think you'd be all right. No, I had a really good time with this story. I think the fact that it evoked that many things that are going on at the moment for me really shows that you're plugged in and you're communicating it well. And yeah, good storytelling as ever, as ever.
Thank you. I'm
Well,
glad. I'm glad that you
yeah,
you came out with something fantastic, even though you were up against writing a sequel to yourself. Now you know how George R. R. Martin feels. Be nicer to him.
for
And
fuck's sake.
even though I definitely I did battle with the prompt to the point that I ended up making up an anagram for the words instead of actually writing something about it. But I think we both
that's got
made it out the other way.
classic Nico overthinking that one. I think
No,
to
it sure does.
create an acronym out of it. Amazing. Oh, right. Well, next week we'll be doing a little bit of a departure from our normal stories. We'll be starting the novella month that we mentioned in, I think it was the last episode we spoke about it.
Yes.
Um, so join us next week for a bit of an exploration towards what we're going to be doing and potentially a bit of a writer's room.
Let's get our dwarf on.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of The Tiny Bookcase.
Remember to subscribe, otherwise you're going to miss out on the future fun.
Also, tell a friend. If you like this episode, link them to it.
We'd be tremendously grateful. You can follow us on Twitter at BookcaseTiny, Facebook at The Tiny Bookcase, and Instagram at Bookcase Tiny for updates. Speaking of supporting the podcast, well, magic can only take one so far. The Tiny Bookcase is supported by the generosity of its patrons. Those kind souls have really kept my belly full the last year. Let's cast a spell for them, shall we? For rich ginger tones on their scalp, let us cast the Orangi Hedondo spell for Scott Byrne, and for general fabulousness, why not the Ooh La La How's Your Mother spell on Matthew McLaren?
How do you come up with that shit, man?